Hello, welcome to the 7th episode of the French Defense Speedrun series here. In this episode, we're playing against players in the rating range of 1200 to 1300 in the rapid rating pool on chess.com. And through the three different games that we are going to take a look at in this video, we're going to be seeing how to take advantage of opponents' mistakes that they play in the opening. But specifically, I would say kind of the highlight of these games is going to be the game where we are able to see our opponent play kind of finally the correct version of the advanced variation of the French defense. Most players that have been playing the advanced variation of the French defense against us in the speedrun series have been playing incorrectly, allowing us to take the d4 pawn. They have to recapture with the piece. They kind of end up in trouble in those positions usually. But we finally get an opponent who plays a bit more principled. They reinforce the pawn chain. They build space in the center. How to play against this type of pawn structure is very important when you're playing the French defense, and that's something I talk a lot about when we get around to that game in this video. Before that, though, there's a couple of other games that we will be taking a look at, being able to play against an exchange variation of the French defense, and being able to get good positions in those games as well. So hopefully you enjoy these games. Let's go ahead and get right into them. All right, so we've got our first game here. We're playing e4, e6. We're against Finrod69, a rated 1134 from Canada. So we go for our French defense. They go for d4 on move number 2. We're going to respond with pawn to d5. And let's see what type of French defense our opponent wants to go for. Do they go for the advanced variation? Do they go for the exchange variation, which is what they've decided to go for here? So we're going to recapture with our pawn. Very equal space situation in the center of the board. And our opponent makes the move knight to c3. Now, generally speaking, against these knight to c3 moves, I usually recommend going for the move pawn to c6. We not only protect the pawn on d5 a little bit better, so that the knight can never capture it, but we also do a pretty good job of controlling additional squares that the knight could potentially jump to. One of the moves that we want to play in the near future is a move like bishop to d6, but we don't want to have to run into knight to b5 jumps that would attack the bishop. So pawn to c6 when the knight's on c3, usually it's a good idea to put a pawn on a square that's kind of two squares away from an opponent's knight, kind of vertically. It limits the knight pretty well, stops the knight from moving forward, and covers some important squares. All right, so our opponent continues with the move bishop to d6. So against bishop to d6, I'm just going to go ahead and continue with bishop, or sorry, they went bishop f4, my apologies. I'm going to continue with bishop to d6. We are just going to trade some pieces. Next, we'll put the knight on the e7 square, put the other bishop on the f5 square, most likely. They decide to retreat the bishop to the g3 square. Now, here, I don't necessarily want to rush to capture this bishop, because if white recaptures with their h-pawn, they do open up the rook, and that could potentially be at least a little bit annoying for us if the rook on the h-file gets to become a bit active. Now, I also don't really mind if white ever takes my bishop, because if I recapture with the queen becomes a bit more active. I put a little bit of pressure on white's position, and I think we're doing totally fine there as well. So right now, the bishops are kind of facing off against one another. And usually in these kind of situations, you don't want to rush to make the capture or make the trade first, unless you have a very good reason to do so, or unless you get some kind of advantage out of the exchange. If we take on g3 and they take with the h-pawn, I kind of feel like white's the one that's getting the advantage, because even though we do double their pawns, they open up the rook, which is pretty useful. So I'm going to develop the knight to the e7 square. f6 is usually a pretty good location as well, but I like going to e7 because there might be some scenarios where we need to support the bishop if it comes out to the f5 square. We might also even play knight to f5 to harass the bishop on g3 and kind of provoke it to make a decision. And then knight on f5 may also attack the pawn on d4 at the right time as well. I do think going knight f6 is also absolutely fine to play. I don't really think there's anything wrong with that. I just like going with the setup of the bishop, with the knight on the e7 square in these types of situations. So white does go for the move bishop to d3. I'm going to go ahead and I don't know if I want to go bishop f5 first or if I want to castle first. Not sure if it really makes a huge difference. I think I'm going to go ahead and castle first, and then I think next move we'll go for bishop f5 against most options that white might play, like knight f3, we'll go bishop f5, knight e2, bishop f5. Of course, if they take on d6, we'll take back. And white decides to play queen h5. So, of course, in this particular situation, we are not going to go bishop f5, because white does cover the f5 score with the queen a second time. And white is currently threatening checkmate, so we definitely need to do something about that. Now, that being said, uh, in terms of how we react to this threat, I think it's very important to figure out the right reaction. So there's a couple of ways of defending against the checkmate. Number one, we could push the h-pawn forward, and then there's no threat since the pawn is on h6 instead of h7. Number two, we could push the pawn to g6. This would block off the bishop and also attack the queen. That would also stop the checkmate and come with a threat at the same time. Number three, we could do knight to g6. That blocks off the diagonal. Pawn to f5 also blocks off the diagonal. The one I'm leaning towards the most myself is going with the move pawn to g6. Not only does it create a threat, but it also gives me a little bit more support over the f5 square in the process, which makes it a little bit easier for me to play the move bishop to f5 in the near future here. So I am going to go pawn to g6. It does weaken my king a little bit. There's no doubt about that. I do have some potentially weak dark squares in this position, but we're probably going to have these dark square bishops get traded at some point anyways. And so if those bishops come off the board in a kind of neutral or favorable circumstance, then I don't really have to worry about the weak dark squares all that much anyways. So in the game, white retreats the queen. They go back to the h4 square specifically. So the question is, do I go knight f5? Do I go bishop f5? I could also go rook to e8, kind of lining up towards the king here. I do think if I go rook e8, white's going to either develop the knight or castle, so I'm not really sure if that does a whole lot for me, quite honestly. So I think I'm leaning towards bishop f5 because I don't think my light square bishop is all that great in these types of pawn structures. It is limited and restricted by all of these pawns on the light squares. And so if I can get rid of this bishop, especially if I can trade it off for the opponent's bishop that's on d3, that's also one less piece that's aiming at my king and one less thing I have to worry about. So I'm going to go for bishop f5. If white takes, I'll take back with the knight. If they take my queen, I'll take back with the rook. I don't mind a couple of pieces getting traded here. Generally speaking, the exchange variation of the French defense is a very solid and equal / you could kind of call a little bit boring from white's perspective. Usually what will happen is because the center of the board opens up, there might be a variety of pieces that are getting traded relatively early in the game. So our opponent does take the bishop. I'm going to take back with the knight. And even though pieces are getting traded, that doesn't necessarily mean that the game is automatically going to be a draw or anything like that. So we will be able to navigate through this kind of equal-ish position that we're getting, especially if white does trade the queens here. If he doesn't trade the queens, he puts the queen on a square where it's simply not safe. I do have my queen on d8 covering the f6 square, and that's a very unfortunate, blunder for my opponent. Kind of wish that he hadn't made that mistake. If he had traded the queens, that would have definitely been the most solid way for him to continue. Let's go to the analysis board and kind of talk through what might have happened there. So e4, e6, d4, d5 goes for the exchange. Knight goes to c3. With the knight on c3, I tend to recommend playing the move c6 in response. Bishop goes to f4. Bishop goes to d6 to trade. Bishop d6 is not the only good move here. You could also go, again, knight f6, bishop e7, bishop to b4, making this pin might be interesting. But I think it's totally fine to go for bishop d6. He keeps the pieces on the board for the moment with bishop to g3. If he had traded on d6, we would have still continued with knight e7 and bishop f5. That would have still been the game plan at that point. But he played bishop g3 instead, still played knight e7, castle, he threatens checkmate. And yeah, as I was saying during the game, we have to figure out how we're going to respond to this threat in the best way possible. I didn't really want to go for pawn to h6. I don't think it's a bad move, but it does make it more difficult for us to accomplish our plan of playing the move bishop f5 and trading off that light square bishop on d3. If we're not able to play bishop f5, then the question is kind of, what do we do with this bishop on c8? Do we go to the e6 square? Maybe. I mean, probably given the circumstance, we'd have to go there at this point because there's not a whole lot else that's better. But I like the idea of playing g6, then trying to trade off that light square bishop. Because generally speaking, in the French defense, especially in these exchange variations, but even in the advanced variation or in the other Fort Knox variation that we'll see more of in the future, in these kind of situations where the pawns get traded in the center, the big issue that both players run into is that black has a bad light square bishop, and white has a bad dark square bishop. And this is mainly because of the pawns in the center of the board, what color each of those pawns are on. White's pawn on d4 is a dark square pawn, thus their bishop on their dark square bishop is the one that's kind of blocked in or restricted by that pawn. And it's the same thing for us. Our bishop on c8 is a light square bishop. We have a light square pawn in the center of the board. So if we can get rid of this bishop, the remaining bishops that are left on the board for each player are a little more active than their counterparts. So that's why I went for bishop f5. And then, yeah, white made a big blunder here. Definitely white should trade the queens. I would take back. Probably, given the circumstance, they should trade the bishops. And I'm not sure if I should take with the knight or the rook. I would kind of lean towards taking with the rook, I suppose. Now white has to guard the pawn on d4. Maybe they play something like knight f3. I would probably develop the knight. They castle. We activate the rook. It's a pretty equal position. Oops, sorry. It's a pretty equal position at the end of the day. There is a little bit of difference in the pawn structure. I would argue here that white's pawn on d4 is a little bit weaker than our pawn on d5. We do have our pawn on d5 supported by a friendly pawn on c6, whereas white's pawn on d4 cannot be supported by their c2 pawn easily because the knight is in the way on c3. So this is a slight drawback to white's position. This knight on c3 is a little bit misplaced, but overall it's probably a pretty equal position. We would have to work to outplay our opponent as the game goes on, but that is, kind of unfortunately not the way the game went. He went to f6, we won the queen, and that's the game. Okay, so that's it for this one. Let's go ahead and get into the next game. All right, back with the next game. Playing against Imagicano from Egypt, rated 1219. E46, they go knight f3, we go d5. We can safely assume a lot of the times their opponents will be going for the exchange in this kind of situation. E5, we've also seen in a few of the other previous games in the Speedrun series. White decides to go for a check on e2 with the queen, which I don't really feel like is all that great of a move because I'm not really sure how white's going to develop the light square bishop after that. So in response, I think here we're just going to block with our bishop. Knight goes to f6 and castle. Usually this is a little bit of a different setup than what we're used to. Usually we would have the bishop on d6 as we saw in the other game, knight on e7. However, in this particular situation, I wasn't able to get the bishop to d6 before putting the knight on e7, and it really wouldn't make a lot of sense to block with the knight on e7 in the first place. I also don't really like the idea of blocking with the light square bishop because this piece can be attacked by the knight pretty easily. And finally, I don't really want to block with the queen and just trade queens at the start. Also, trading the queens kind of helps white because the queen is kind of in the way of the bishop right now. So blocking with the bishop makes a lot of sense. White brings the queen out to give a check. Now we have to block this check. Pawn to c6 looks pretty straightforward. We hit the queen and also guard the pawn, even though the pawn's not really in any danger right now. If we block with the bishop, we might, or not might, but we would end up losing the pawn on d7, which is probably not what we want to do. Alternatively, white could take the pawn on d5. I also don't really want to block with the knight and have my knight pinned, so I'm just going to block with the pawn. The queen has to move a third time in a row. It went to e2, b5. It's going to have to go back, in this case, to b3. That's where it decides to go. And now I'm just going to continue developing my pieces ASAP and trying to take advantage of white having wasted a lot of time with their queen zipping all over the place. So knight f6, get castle, put a rook in the center. Probably one day we can maneuver a knight to the c5 square to attack, in this case, the queen as well as the bishop. I think knight d7 right now is totally fine. I think I'm going to castle first, though. Might as well just castle and activate the pieces. But I do want to go knight d7 now, because I like the idea of the knight going to the c5 square, attacking the bishop as well as the queen. The bishop on d3 is really not in a great location, and as you can see, white ends up moving it a second time. Usually you don't want to block your central pawns if you can help it. If white wanted to put the bishop on d3, they should have played pawn to d4 and then bishop to d3. That would have been a better way to organize the pieces. So they move the bishop a second time. Let's just go ahead and attack the queen anyways. If white gets the chance to play d4, they're going to lock my knight out from moving forward, so we might as well hit the queen first. Queen is going to move somewhere, maybe e3. If they do that, we'll probably line up towards the queen with rook e8. So yeah, white's wasting a lot of time in the opening phase here. They're not making anything they're not making any kind of egregious blunders, I would say. They haven't lost any material or anything like that. But we've got more space in the center. We have three minor pieces developed compared to their two. They've moved the queen, one, two, three, four times. They moved this bishop two times already. The queen is now in the way of the knight developing, which is probably not a great situation. So yeah, it doesn't really feel like doesn't feel like the opening has worked out well the way White would have liked it to. Do we keep attacking the queen? I mean, we could play this knight into e4. Looks like a reasonable option. Could move the other knight to e4 as well. Could also play rook e8 and just develop and line up towards the undefended bishop, which looks pretty reasonable. Probably all of these moves are pretty good. I don't really see a big preference on any of them. I'm leaning towards simply pestering the queen, but I'm not sure which knight to use. Probably we should use the c5 knight. I want to get some extra pieces over towards the king side. But then it might be the case that this knight gets kicked by the d-pawn later anyway. So maybe I'll start with the move rook e8. I'm just going to develop a new piece. My knight is protected. Line up towards an undefended piece. White decides to play the move d4 to attack the knight. Now I will hop into e4, because now there's no pawn that can go up to the d3 square to attack my knight. So I wouldn't really say that d4 is a bad move for White, because it is controlling the center. It's very useful. But it is also giving me the access to the e4 square, and they have a bit of a harder time kicking my knight off of this square now. So White goes back to e1, which feels like a very risky location to put the queen, because it is lining up towards the bishop, lining up with our rook on e8. There are a bunch of pieces in the way, but always have to be a bit careful about lining up with an opponent's rook with your queen. So I'm going to move the bishop to d6, starting to eye the king side here. Maybe move the queen to c7, maybe knight to g4. I'm really liking knight g4 now, especially since it also hits the bishop at the same time. Yeah, I think I'm going to go for knight g4. Let's pester the bishop. I might take the bishop, and then they're going to be left over with a weak pawn on the e3 square. They go knight to c3. We could take on c3. The queen would probably have to take back. We could take the bishop first, which is what I'm kind of leaning towards. We could also start with queen to c7 to hit the pawn on h2 first and see what White does about that. Yeah, I'm going to go for that, actually. Let's go for queen c7. I'm not really in a rush to take this bishop because it's not really running away anywhere anytime soon. So let's go here, attack this pawn. If they play h3, then I'll go ahead and probably take the bishop. They decide to take the knight on e4. The problem with this move, though, is that once I recapture with my pawn, not only am I still attacking the h2 pawn with a bunch of pieces, but I am also now attacking the knight. Oops, sorry. I am attacking the knight that's on f3 at the same time. And really, White doesn't have a good way to save both the knight and the h2 pawn. So they end up moving the knight away. But I can now just go for the move bishop takes h2 with check. King has to move over to h1. The only legal move. And once the king's on h1, I think we have a very cool tactical pattern that's available here. I think it works. Let's see. So what we would really like to do is not have the bishop on h2. If our bishop was not on h2, if it was just gone, we could play queen to h2 and deliver checkmate because the knight would be protecting the queen. The problem is, if I move the bishop backwards, it's still in the way of the queen, so I'm still not really threatening checkmate. What we could do here that's a very cool move, and it is a nice pattern to be aware of, you could play the move bishop to g1. That gets the bishop out of the way of the queen, and then we would be threatening queen to h2 with checkmate. And even if the bishop is captured, queen h2 is still checkmate because the knight on g4 covers the h2 square. And also, if the knight is captured, queen h2 is still checkmate because the bishop on g1 protects the queen on h2. So pretty much here, if we go bishop g1, White has to play the move g3. I think that's kind of mandatory at this point. And then it might look like our bishop is stuck on the g1 square. You might kind of wonder, like, okay, you tried something fancy. Like, how do you get the bishop out of there now? But the bishop on g1 is actually helping to aim towards the e3 bishop from kind of backwards, from behind here. So what I think that means is that bishop g1, g3, we take this bishop on e3 now. If they take back, then we take on e3 with our bishop, and I think we're in good shape there. If they instead take our bishop on g1, our knight on e3 can take the pawn on c2, forking the queen and the rook. The only thing I'm a little bit concerned about with this sequence is that if I take back on e3, it's white's move, and he could try the move bishop to c4 once my bishop is on e3. Bishop to c4 would open up the attack on my bishop on e3. I know I'll have to go like full Hikaru mode with all these arrows here, but I'm going to try to explain it as best as I can. My bishop on e3 is being attacked by the queen on e1. My pawn on f7 is being attacked by the rook and the bishop on c4 and f1. And there's not really a great way to save both the bishop and the f7 pawn. There is bishop takes knight on d2. So this, take this, knight on d2. Then they could, because if I take on d2, I am attacking their queen. If they take back on d2, then I can save the pawn on f7. Then I have a free move to play defense. If instead they take on f7, I take their queen. They get my queen with check. I move the king. They get my bishop. And I think after all of that, I'm up one pawn. I think I'm up one pawn, but I don't really know if that's the best way to play. I don't really know if that's the best way to play, to be quite honest with you. I don't think it is. Here, 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 here. Here, 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 here. I guess I have bishop e6. Maybe I do. Okay, so I'm actually gonna go for it. I know I thought for about 4 minutes on this position, also explaining things. First things first, probably white's going to make a mistake here, and they very well may just like let themselves get mated next move. It wouldn't surprise me if that was to happen. Okay, they do play g3. So my plan was to take this bishop on e3. Attack the rook, threaten the fork. Okay, so I do think they should have taken the knight. Here I'm able to take on c2, hit the queen, hit the rook. We're going to take the rook, and then we're going to be up the exchange plus a pawn. I think plus 2 pawns, actually. So we take the rook. And yeah, we're just up the exchange and 2 pawns. So a little bit anticlimactic. I am going to have to speed up here quite a bit, though. So let's do this. I'm going to play e3, trying to open up the position, hit the bishop, hit the pawn. And yeah, we only have a minute left on the clock, but we are up, 4 points in material, up the exchange, up 2 pawns. Very much a winning position. Just going to activate the rest of my pieces here. I can take this pawn on g3. Then I can take here with check. Here I can back the rook up and try to check on h6, which would be very close to checkmate. We check there. If the knight blocks, we take that knight on h2. If the bishop blocks, we take with the rook. And we do get the checkmate. Okay, so I'm actually very curious about this position we had earlier. We will get around to it. Let's start with our analysis from the beginning. So e4, e6, knight f3, d5, pawns get traded. I don't think this check is all that good. As you saw in the game, they've moved the queen 3 times in a row. That being said, these are not blunder moves by any means. Like, if you look at this computer evaluation, the evaluation here is like 0.5 in black's favor. So even though white has made kind of not very good opening moves, the moves are not so bad that we're able to just crush them or win material and win the game easily. Like, Other games we've seen in the speedrun series, opponents have made worse mistakes in the opening that we have been able to capitalize on easier. These moves are not very good, but they're not terrible at the same time. I'll put it that way. So I was just prioritizing development. Develop the knight, castle, develop the knight here. I wanted to play knight c5 to attack the queen and the bishop. He did retreat the bishop. We hit the queen. Queen has to move again. We lined up towards the bishop. We hit the queen. And I think all of this leads us into a position that is very good for us. And I think that this was the kind of key moment in the game. Well, this is for sure the position I've spent the longest amount of time on. So we're up a pawn, which is already good. And I think that bishop g1 works the more I looked at it, but I did take quite a long time to figure it out here. That being said, bishop g1 is absolutely not necessary here. It's a little bit... I would say here, I think in a... let's say a game where I'm trying to, like, if I had more time on the clock, let me put it that way. If I had more time on the clock to really think through my bishop g1 decision, I may end up coming to the decision, if I wasn't really so sure about bishop g1, I may end up coming to the decision that I'll just play something different instead, because it's a position where, like, almost anything wins at this point. Like, in hindsight, it might be very simple to take the bishop on e3, hit the queen, and then do something like this. And I think white is also pretty much dead in this kind of position as well. It's very, very hard to stop this mating attack. That all being said, I really wanted to go for bishop g1 because it also looks very cool. It's a very cool pattern. The computer says, so the computer says it's like a -2 position for black, but it says this move of knight takes e3 and bishop g3, this is like -4.5. So little bit of fancy play syndrome there maybe. I do think bishop g1 is a very cool pattern to be aware of, though. That being said, the best way for white to play is g3, and then they should definitely take on e3. And yeah, the evaluation actually goes a little further down. Now it's only about 0.7 or 0.8 for black. So I think it would have been better, instead of playing knight takes e3, I suppose we should be playing probably bishop takes f2 and then pawn to e3, or sorry, take on f2 a couple of times and then pawn to e3. This would actually work out pretty well for us. So again, I think if I had more time to really think through this, I would maybe calculate a little bit differently and play a different move. But I thought it was a very cool move. I think it's pretty instructive. Even here, I'm kind of, playing against a much lower rated player, but, not playing perfectly necessarily. And we were able to kind of make the best of the situation that we had, even without perfect calculation. But I do definitely think it's best for them to take the knight, and then this bishop c4 move, I think, is the key trick. Hitting this pawn, hitting this bishop. I was planning on playing bishop takes d2. I think white's best move is rook takes f7, and the computer is agreeing with all of this. I know you might not be able to see it in the video, but I'm seeing it on the side. My plan was to take the queen. They take here with check. I block. They take. I take. They take. And then I think I was just going to guard the pawn. Something like this. And the computer does say black is a bit better. It says like 0.4 advantage. We are up one pawn in this position. But considering how great our position looked earlier, this whole sequence of bishop g1 and knight takes e3 and bishop takes e3, it ends up that this is something that works out more, like it's more helpful for white than it was for us, assuming that white plays the best way, which our opponent did not do. So very interesting piece of calculation there. This was kind of a, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, kind of an 8-move calculation sequence, but it kind of ended up being unnecessary at the end of the day. So I don't want anybody to take away from this game like, oh, I have to be able to see some 8-move calculation to get the best position. Keep in mind, this wasn't even the best way to play. So kind of interesting in that regard. So anyways, though, it did work out in the game because our opponent took on g1. This was a big mistake. We took c2, we took the rook, and then from there, we're just trying to open up the position for the rest of our pieces. and eventually we got the checkmate on the H-file. So yeah, very interesting position with that calculation. Even though the calculation wasn't exactly correct. Yeah, in hindsight, it would have been simpler just to take the bishop, drop back. The fancy play, maybe not being the best way to do things here, but I thought it was a very interesting position to analyze nonetheless. So hopefully you enjoyed this game. Let's get into our next one. All right, on to our third game. Playing against Nesudimov, rated 1266. And they're starting off with e4, e6, d4, d5. We're going for our French defense. We'll see what version they decide to play. And they decide to go for the advanced variation. So against the move e5, we are playing c5 to strike at the opponent's central pawn. And our opponent's playing c3. So I think that this is the... I don't know if this is the first, but this is definitely one of the very few people who have played the advanced version of the French defense in the what you could kind of call like the correct way. Most people in the speedrun so far have been playing moves like knight f3 or bishop to e3 or doing things that don't really reinforce the d4 pawn with another pawn. And the move c3 is definitely the best move for white to play in this position because they build this kind of connect four pawn chain, you could call it. They have four pawns connected diagonally here. And if we take the pawn on d4, they're going to recapture with the pawn. And generally speaking, we're not going to be in a rush to make this trade of pawns when the opponent can recapture with the c3 pawn. When they had the knight or the bishop or other pieces protecting the d4 pawn, we were rushing to take on d4 because a piece had to recapture. But when our opponent plays the move c3, they are able to recapture with the pawn, and thus we're not really in a rush to trade off the c5 and c3 pawns. So what I recommend in this particular way of playing, or against this way of playing, is I like to make the move queen to b6, with the plan of playing bishop to d7, followed by bishop to b5, and we are really looking to trade off what is known as our bad bishop in this type of French defense. This is the bishop that is restricted by our central pawns. Light square bishop, light square pawns. The bishop is blocked in by the pawns. We're looking to trade off our bad bishop for our opponent's good bishop. This bishop of whites on f1 is not restricted by their pawns that have been advanced. All three of these pawns are all on dark squares, and this is a light square bishop. So they don't really block one another or interfere with one another. So and I will say, in a lot of situations, when you have a locked pawn structure, in this case, it's kind of this E4, E5, E6, D4, D5 type of pawn structure. A lot of the times when there's a locked pawn structure, this can also apply for like a King's Indian defense or other openings as well. One player's bad bishop will be the other player's good bishop a lot of the time, and vice versa. Our good bishop will be the opponent's bad bishop. So again, our light square bishop is bad, their light square bishop is good. What this means is that our dark square bishop is good and their dark square bishop is bad. Again, it's based on the pawns that are in the center. So I'm going to continue with bishop d7. The plan is to play the move bishop to b5, and we're going to look to exchange off our bad bishop for the opponent's good one. Now, there are some ways that white can work around this and try to prevent it. They could try a move like pawn to a4, for instance, which we'll maybe see in a future game. In this particular case, though, they play a pretty common move. I think bishop to e2 and bishop to d3. These are definitely the two most common moves in the position, especially at the club level of play. That doesn't really stop us from our plan. We're playing the move bishop to b5, and we're looking to exchange off these bishops. Now, it may feel like we're breaking this, general opening principle of not, you generally don't want to move the same piece multiple times in the opening phase. We are moving the bishop 1, 2, 3 times in order to capture their bishop on e2 that's only moved one time. That is a good principle to generally follow, I will say. However, it is also important to recognize when principles apply and when principles are not as important. In this type of position, when the center of the board is locked up and closed, you can usually get away with slightly slower plans because the middle of the board isn't about to blow open and become super chaotic. If the position was much more open, if there had been more pawns that had been traded and the center of the board was much more kind of free-flowing, you could call it, then it would be quite risky to move the same piece multiple times in the opening phase without developing the other pieces first. Here, though, the center of the board is a bit more closed, so we can kind of get away with slightly slower plans. All that being said, we're going to go ahead and make the exchange of pieces. We play bishop takes e2. The queen is going to recapture. And then in this particular case, we're going to have a decision of taking on the, do we take the d4 pawn or do we do something different? In this particular scenario, we are going to want to make the capture on d4. This is what I would recommend here. If you don't make the capture yourself, let's say we did a move like knight to c6 instead, white could potentially take our pawn. We would take with the bishop. They can gain space and kick our bishop. Our bishop moves. Their bishop comes out and hits our queen. It is good to trade the pawns once you've traded off the light square bishop specifically, because you get to kind of clarify, you could say, the pawn structure in the center of the board. And now the pawns are definitely stuck on these dark squares. The d4 pawn is what's known as a backward pawn, and it is going to be the focus of our gameplay in the middle in this middle game phase. So what we're going to do is go for the move knight to c6, put pressure on the pawn. We're going to look to develop the other knight to the f5 square to add more pressure to the pawn, and then we're going to develop our dark square bishop after that. It is very important that you sequence these moves or sequence the development correctly. If you try to develop the dark square bishop first, then your bishop is in the way of the knight. And it's kind of hard to move the bishop out of the way when it's already on the e7 square. Whereas if you move the knight up to the f5 square first, then the e7 square is open for the bishop, and then you're not really all that bothered by the, the pieces aren't stepping on each other's toes as much. So we're going to get the knight to the f5 square, put the bishop on e7, castle the king, and mostly we're going to look to play around the queen side part of the board. Usually when you have a closed position, the direction or part of the board you want to play on is usually determined by where you either have more space or where your pawn chain is pointing. In this position, our pawn chain is kind of pointing diagonally, towards the queen side. Conversely, white's pawn chain is pointing diagonally towards our king side. They have a bit more space on the king side part of the board because of this e5 pawn. We don't really have more space on the queen side part of the board necessarily, but the weakness of our opponent, which is again this d4 pawn that's kind of the backward pawn or in this position, it is kind of on the queen side or kind of right half of the board here. So again, we're going to prioritize the queen side play in this position and look to play in this right half of the board for the most part. Okay, so white's played queen to d2. They are defending the d4 pawn. There is a possibility here of playing something like knight to a5 and trying to get into one of these weak light squares. I think I'm going to prioritize the kingside development, get the bishop in the game and castle first before I touch any more pieces that have already moved once, because we don't want to just move a bunch of knights and move our queen and never get the king castled. So also, I think if I go knight a5, the queen will move, and I won't really be able to get a fork anyways. So I'm going to prioritize development. We're going to go bishop to e7. We're going to castle, and then we're going to bring one of the rooks to the c file, and we're going to try to play around, again, this queen side part of the board. Also, I want to note, I'm not really in a rush to make this capture on e3 anytime soon. This is white's bad bishop. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Based on the pawns in the center of the board, this bishop on e3 is not their best piece in the world. And my knight on f5 is pretty good. My knight is kind of offensive, and their bishop is defensive. I don't really want to make this capture unless it benefits me or unless I really need to do it. So white plays the move b4. This feels a bit on the wrong side of the board because we did just talk about how the queen side part of the board is the side I should be prioritizing myself. So I could go ahead and just castle here. I don't think there's really anything wrong with that. But I'm actually going to strike with the move a5 here first. And this is a very important pawn break to be on the lookout for in a lot of these French defense positions. If your opponent's gone for the move b4, especially if they're not easily able to support the b pawn and hold it in place, you can go for the move a5, chip away at the pawn, force them in this case to capture us on a5. And now once I recapture, they're going to be left over with an isolated a3 pawn. Now I am going to capture with the knight this time. Not only am I potentially looking to fork on b3, but you could also go to the c4 square at the right time as well. So knight to b3 does not actually win material here right away, because white would be able to play the move queen to b2 and pin my knight. So with that in mind, I wonder if I can kind of make it work somehow. I don't think I can make it work right away. I would need my queen protected somehow. So I could play rook a6, which is kind of an interesting move. It might also help to double up the rooks on the a file later. But I could also just castle the king as well. I think I'm going to try this rook a6 move, quite honestly. This knight to b3 move is a big enough threat that I think that that rook to a6 is an interesting way of making the threat kind of a reality here, because now the queen is protected. Now when I go knight b3 and they play queen b2, I can take the rook because then my queen would be protected. So they move the queen, which is fine. I think here I am going to go ahead and castle. I could also go queen to b3, but I'm going to castle the king. Look to develop the other rook over towards this side of the board. White goes knight to c3. Now I do have to be a little bit careful in this position. There are definitely some tricks that white has associated with the move knight takes d5 and then queen takes f5 because my pawn on e6 is defending two things at the same time. So I'm actually going to play the move. Let's see here. I think I'm going to go, well, no, I don't want to do that. I think I'm going to go g6. Playing a little slowly here. g6, not the best move in the world, I imagine. It is weakening some of the dark squares around the king, but I'm really just trying to keep the knight held in place in this position if I can help it. So he plays rook b1, he hits my queen. I'm going to move over to the c6 square, keep a little bit of an eye on the a4 pawn, and then maybe I'll play queen c4, maybe I'll play knight c4. He plays knight to b5. I'm going to go for the knight c4 move, I think. Yeah, let's go for knight to c4. We are targeting the pawn on a4. Maybe we'll swing the rook over to double up on the pawn, and it's going to be a little bit tricky for white to keep this pawn protected forever. I'm also keeping pressure on the bishop. So if the queen moves too far away from the bishop, I might take the bishop and be in good shape there. So he is not protecting the a4 pawn. I believe I can just capture that pawn for free. And if the knight moves backwards, I can play rook to a3 to pin the knight. Yeah, we're quite low on time here, but we have picked up a pawn. Our pieces are looking good. We're doing a lot of play on with our knights and queen and rook on the light squares. And really our bishop on e7 is the piece that's kind of filling in the gaps and covering the dark squares in a case like this. So I'm going to go rook a3, just pin the knight. The queen also needs to keep protection of the bishop, so if it moves away, we might be able to take the bishop in this position. And it's a bit of an awkward position for white here. Not terribly easy for them to solve their problems. They do move the queen backwards here. I'm going to go ahead and double the rooks up. If the knight moves away, I might play rook a2 to attack the queen. And the general game plan here, now that I've won the a3 pawn, or now that it was on a4, sorry, now that I've won the a pawn, I do want to start pushing the b pawn up the board. This is my passed pawn. As I've talked about in other games in the speedrun series, when you have an extra pawn, especially if it is a passed pawn, you want to try to push the pawn and make use of it. Now that I'm saying this, I am noticing that I did have knight takes e3, and then maybe rook takes c3. I guess knight takes, maybe knight to b5, knight goes back. I think I had the chance right there to win material. But okay, maybe the opportunity will still persist here. But yeah, I think we might have had the chance to win material there. But okay, we're up a pawn. Things are still pretty good. Let's see what white does to deal with it. So they play g3. I don't think they're addressing the threat. So now I can take the bishop using this knight. If they recapture, now I take the knight on c3, and now I'm just up a piece in this position. If the knight had moved away and given a discovered attack, then I would have been able to bring my knight back to the c4 square to block off the discovered attack, block off the c-file. So here we're up a piece and a pawn. I'm going to make the move rook to a1, I believe, just to pin the rook and trade pieces. And the game plan is pretty straightforward. We want to trade pieces and then push the b pawn up the board. I'm also now threatening to take the rook and then the e3 pawn, so they have to keep an eye on that. probably they should take the rook. Okay, they do this. I'm just going to go ahead and make the exchange. If the queen takes, I'm happy to trade queens. If the knight takes, then I'll probably play bishop to g5 to attack the pawn, I think. So they might go knight to g2 to protect it. I'm not sure. They go knight to c2. Here I can play the move pawn to b5, because if they take my pawn on b5, I win the knight on c2. So now I'm using like little small tactics to improve my own position. And the game plan is still just to push the pawn up the board. Not really a whole lot that that white can do about that. So here I'm actually going to take the pawn on e3. I am sacrificing a piece for a couple of pawns. But the problem for white is I am going to win this knight on e3, and once I eventually take this knight, I'm going to be up enough pawns in the king and pawn in game that we can win the king and pawn in game with not too much trouble. So the game plan is really just to take another pawn, eventually trade the queens. I could also just take the knight on e3 next move, and we're already up 3 pawns in this king and pawn in game, and there's not really a whole lot white can do to stop us from winning the king and pawn in game. So in this case, I'll just pick up a third pawn. The knight is still pinned. We'll just trade the queens and go from there. So they decide to leave the knight hanging. We will take the knight. We are up the full piece plus a couple pawns. We'll protect the bishop. Push the pawn. Push the pawn. White is going to run out of king moves. They'll eventually have to move to an unfortunate square, and then I can push the b pawn. I don't need to push the b pawn just yet. I can freeze their pawns first. Wait with my king, and then no matter where the king goes, I will push the b pawn and he won't be able to catch it. So I'll have to play a little bit quick with the time situation here through the last few moves of the game, but we'll promote, we'll make a queen, we'll go and pick up those pawns, probably also just push the d pawn. Push, push, push. I'm just pre-moving the pushes at this point. I'm going to make a second queen. And yeah, they're going to have to play king to d4 and then king to c3 and then queen to d4 will be the checkmate here. Okay, so I had to go a little bit quickly through the end of that game there, but let's go ahead and go back and analyze it here. So in the game, it starts off with e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, and as I said during the game, I was thinking about it a little bit more. This might be the very first game, actually, where somebody plays c3 to defend the d4 pawn. This is the best move in the position, and we will see it more as the speedrun continues. So the game plan that I recommend when our opponent plays the advanced variation of the French defense and plays the move c3 is I like this queen to b6, maneuver the bishop to b5, and try to trade off your bad bishop. Because if you get rid of this bishop, this light square bishop that's blocked behind your pawns, and at the same time get rid of your opponent's good bishop that's not blocked behind their pawns, it's usually an advantageous trade for us. It gets rid of something that's bad for us and gets rid of something that's good for the opponent, which is kind of a win-win situation for us. So queen b6, knight f3, bishop d7. There's a couple of ways of trying to prevent bishop to b5. a4 is one of them. But if white goes pawn to a4, I would recommend I think I recommend just trading the pawns on d4. You might actually be able to play knight c6 first, but the general idea is you're going to trade the pawns on d4, and once they are inevitably traded, because white played the move a4, they have weakened the b4 square in the process, and now you can use that square for a bishop check, or you can develop the knight first and then check afterwards. And it's already a slightly worse version of things for white because the pawn on a4 can no longer go backwards and cover that b4 square. And we have a couple of pieces that can use that square pretty well. So a4 does stop bishop to b5, but it has the downside of weakening the b4 square in the process. So white didn't stop it though. We went bishop b5, we trade off the pieces. And then here, as I was saying during the game, I think it's very important to make the trade of pawns right away in this position. If we go knight to c6, white now has the opportunity to take the pawn. We recapture. They can play something like b4 to kick the bishop away, attack our queen. They can go even, I think, maybe knight to a3 and knight to b5 ideas. It gets very messy for us here. It's kind of awkward to develop our kingside pieces because the bishop is in the way of the knight. And it's also very risky to take the pawn in the center. Like moves like this are always going to be very risky for us. Very risky to go pawn grabbing when your king is stuck in the center of the board in a position like this. So we don't really want to have that type of position. So we trade the pawns first, then we develop the knight, and now there's no ability for white to take the pawn on c5. So white develops, we develop, and as I said during the game as well, it's very important that you develop the knight before the bishop in these closed, uh, kind of closed pawn structures, because if you develop the bishop first, the question is, what do you do with the knight? You can't go to e7. You can't go to f6. Are you wanting to go to h6 and maybe walk into white taking your knight and messing up your pawns on the king side? Now where is your king going to feel safe? So you don't really want to do that. You want to develop the knight first because the knight has a kind of useful square it can maneuver towards. The bishop is a little bit more kind of floating around a little bit. The bishop doesn't really have a great place it wants to be on just yet. E7 is kind of the best square, but you need the knight to kind of pass through there before you can put the bishop there. So all of this happens. This a5 move striking against the b4 pawn on the queen side is good for us. I think it would have been a wiser decision for white to just go ahead and develop the knight. I would have probably just castled, brought one of the rooks over, played on the queen side part of the board. Black is a little bit better in these types of positions, and a lot of this is due in part to us having traded off our bad bishop for the opponent's good one, and their bad bishop is left on the board while ours is not a bad bishop. So it's a little bit of a better position for black, but not by a ton. But yeah, pawn to b4 helps us out because after a5, we're able to open up the side of the board where we have the advantage in the first place. We also isolate white's pawn on a3, and then we have plans of attacking over on the queen side pretty quickly. So a4, I didn't rush for knight b3 yet because they had the move queen to b2 to pin the knight. So I began with rook to a6, which is an interesting idea. They moved away from the fork, we castled. And this is also an important type of tactic to be on the lookout for when you're playing the French defense. Whenever you have a knight on f5, and especially if your light square bishop's already been traded off, you have to be a little bit careful of these knight takes d5 and then queen takes f5 tactics. If here I was just to autopilot and just double the rooks up, white would be able to take the pawn, and all of a sudden a position like this is not really all that good for us. There was really no need for us to lose this pawn in the first place. So we don't want to let that happen. That's why I played the move g6. May not be the absolute best way of keeping the knight reinforced. It does have some drawbacks of weakening my own king, but it does get the job done. So now knight takes d5 is not a problem because the knight on f5 is protected. So they hit the queen, they moved the knight forward, we moved our knight, and then we were able to pick up the pawn, which was nice. We pinned the knight. And then, yeah, I think in hindsight here, I could have taken this bishop one move earlier. We did this one move later, but I think it was possible to go for it a move earlier. And if white tries the move knight to b5, trying to attack the queen and the rook, and the knight is still hit, I would have just retreated the knight to safety. And then a position like this, maybe with the bishop or the rook, I'm not sure. A position like this is very good for black because we have a bishop and knight versus the opponent's rook, and usually two minor pieces will outperform a rook in the large majority of situations. So that would be very good for us. Instead, though, they lost the knight for free. Then we trade the rooks. Then we attack the weak pawn on e3. And then I'm just prioritizing pushing my passed pawn and trying to promote it. So I push b5. If they take, I would win the knight. Here I decided to capture on e3. I think there's other moves that work too. You could retreat the knight back to safety if you wanted. I just decided to do it this way, where I just collect a bunch of pawns. I'm also going to guarantee a queen trade because they can't move the knight without allowing the trade of queens. And if they move the queen, then I'll still take the knight and trade a bunch of pieces. Once we do get into this endgame, even if I did not have the bishop, it would be completely winning for me because I'm ahead 4 pawns, and these 4 pawns will just roll down the board with or without the bishop being on the board to help them. So here we just push the pawns, eventually promote to a queen, promote them both, and get the checkmate. So yeah, very nice that our opponent here in this particular game kind of played the proper way against the French defense, at least in terms of doing the c3 move to reinforce their d4 pawn. So we will see more games in the future as the opponents progressively get stronger and stronger, where players are playing kind of the more you could call it kind of correct or optimal way of playing against the French defense, as well as other openings in the speedrun series. So this was a good example where our opponent started off the game pretty solidly, but they did also make mistakes later that we were able to capitalize on. So that's it for our 3 games in this video for this episode. Hopefully you enjoyed these 3. I will see you around in the next video in the speedrun series.